I'm Devin Dwyer at the Supreme Court. Can you be fired for being gay or transgender in America? That was the question the justices grappled with today.
What do we want? Equality! What do we want? Now!
I'm not only fighting for myself, but I'm fighting for you too. And we're going to make this right.
It got me mad enough to do something about it.
What's at stake, how the justices are likely to decide.
This is probably the most consequential case for LGBTQ plus rights, civil rights that the Supreme Court will hear in my lifetime.
Our team is here to break it down. Plus, the president's decision to pull U.S. troops out of Syria and the latest on the impeachment fight here on Capitol Hill, right now in the briefing room. Hey everybody, great to have you with us today. Like we said, we'll get to those breaking developments on impeachment and the president's decision to pull those U.S. troops back from the border in Syria coming up. But first, it was a momentous day here at the United States Supreme Court, drawing significant protests out front, as you saw here, even a couple of bomb threats earlier today. The justices hearing for the first time publicly, especially with this new conservative majority, taking on this issue of gay rights today. And Kate Shaw is here. She was in the courtroom with me. Kate, this was 3 cases. Very significant stories involving transgender gay Americans who were discriminated against because they were who they are.
That's right. So, Devin, in about half of the states, there's actually no state or local law that protects you against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. So all there is this big federal law, the Civil Rights Act, that has a prohibition on sex discrimination. And the question is, does that prevent employers from discriminating on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity? The court has never answered that question, though it has held that marriage equality exists nationwide. There's no answer to this question that the court has yet provided, and so that's what they were wrestling with today.
And 3 human cases at the center of all this. There was a funeral home employee who was fired, transgender woman from Michigan. There was a skydiver from New York State who lost his job after telling a customer that he was gay. And then there was the story of Gerald Bostock, which we brought you yesterday here in the briefing room, man from Georgia, Clayton County Child Welfare Services coordinator. He says after his employer learned he was gay, he got dismissed.
Yeah, and you know, these are all, as you said, really compelling sort of human stories at the heart of these cases. And so you heard a little bit about that, but to be honest, today the justices were kind of wrestling with these more abstract legal questions, right? So how do you decide what a statute that was passed in 1964 should mean today, right? So probably people weren't thinking in 1964 about prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. We just weren't there yet. So the question is, you know, things have changed a lot in the intervening 50 years. So should the justices read this old statute to include this kind of protection? Or, as some of the justices suggested, is that really for Congress to do? And the court should essentially stay its hand, let the democratic process run its course. So those are the questions that they're wrestling with.
It was a really passionate debate. You and I were in there. We were also in the courtroom with Terry Moran, ABC News chief national correspondent, also a veteran of court happenings. Terry, great to have you join us.
Good to be here. A little late.
Well, it's okay. Better late than never. You're a busy man, but what was your take today, your big takeaway today? The justices did seem inclined to want to protect these Americans, but they also really were grappling with the implications of a sweeping decision.
Not as much as I thought, though. It was a legal discussion, as it should be. This is the Supreme Court, but these are some of the most divisive issues in our country, right? Like, a lot of conservatives feel that this is part of what they think of as a culture war out to change their understanding of America. For a lot of people, especially young people, this is the future. This is the way life is going to be. And you actually didn't get a lot of that in the court. They were sticking to their knitting in a lot of ways, with a couple of exceptions. One of them brought up by Justice Neil Gorsuch, one of the Trump appointees, who you'd think would be, you know, as he often is, kind of hardcore conservative on this. But he sounded certainly very empathetic to the position of the 2 gay men who were fired and the transgender woman who was fired. And his hesitancy was, is this really our job?
Right.
Something that he said is going to cause so much social upheaval should courts be doing it.
And yet you saw, guys, you saw the plaintiffs in this case, the 3 individuals, just talk about trying to make a textualist argument, not to get too weedsy, but those conservatives on the court have made such a stink over the years about sticking to the text of the law. And in this case, they said it's plain and simple. They argued that because of sex applies to people based on their gender identity and sexual orientation.
Right, so that's what these plaintiffs are arguing. If you're fired because you're a man and you're dating a man, that's obviously discrimination because of sex. So you don't have to look beyond just the words of this 1964 statute to get to a victory. At least that's what the plaintiffs are hoping. And so you did see these kind of, sometimes the ordinary roles in these cases were a little bit reversed. And I agree with Terry, it was a little unexpected that this very conservative Trump appointee, Neil Gorsuch, seemed to be more open to the plaintiffs' arguments than I think you might have anticipated going in. Chief Justice Roberts seemed at least a little bit open as well. And of course, you know, all it takes, I think the 4 more liberal justices will almost certainly side with these discrimination plaintiffs. So you just need to find one other vote in order to get to 5, and maybe you could even get to 6. You know, I think coming out of this argument, it's really anyone's guess how this is going to come out.
It's going to be a fascinating debate. Stay with us because we're going to get into some more of what we heard today. Inside, one of the people in the courtroom today was Amy Stevens. She was that transgender woman who worked at a funeral home in Michigan. She told us yesterday just how she was fired from her job, which she had for 6 years, and how it impacted her life. Take a look. You were a professional at this funeral home in Michigan for years.
Yes.
You had been a faithful employee. You liked your colleagues.
Yes.
You were praised by your boss.
Yes.
And then there was that day in 2013 when you wrote a letter. Tell us about that experience.
Let's back up a little bit. In 2012, where all this started was I'd basically been living 2 lives, and it got to the point of being nearly impossible to keep doing that. And I almost took my own life. But in that instant, I made the decision that I liked me too much and that I chose to live instead. And that's when I started writing the letter. And it took maybe 6 to 8 months to come up with a version that I was happy with, that explained what was going on in my life and where I was at and what I needed to do. When I gave him the letter, he read it, he folded it up and put it in his pocket and said, "I'll have to think about it." Well, then 2 weeks later, he came back, handed me a letter that was dismissing me, that they didn't need me anymore. And that basically made me mad, because here I put the time in, done my job and did it very well, and now all of a sudden they don't need me anymore.
Must have been devastating.
It was, but it got me mad enough to do something about it, and the only thing I knew to do was to contact an attorney and see where we stood.
And now you have your day in court.
Now we have it.
Finally, Amy, what's your message to Americans who don't understand what it means to be transgender and may struggle with employees like yourself in their own workplaces, or struggle with what to do like your boss struggled with? What do you say to them?
I think the secret is education. If you don't understand it, or you have trouble wrapping your mind around it, do your own research. Don't listen to what your friend says or anybody else. Do your own research and find out. And make it a point to get to know a trans person, because then you find out that we're not any different than anybody else. We all want the same things, to be able to work and live and survive.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure meeting you. Amy Stevens bringing that case forward, guys. In large part, she told me to educate people, and it did seem today that her attorneys were trying to educate the justices at time, who some of them seem to really grapple with this idea of gender identity. Certainly, as you alluded to, not something that the drafters of that 1964 law had envisioned at the time, but they're really wondering how to apply that here. And as Justice Gorsuch mentioned, a lot of Americans are really uncomfortable with this idea. How do they account for that, Terry?
Well, some of them were on the court, it looked like. I mean, it didn't look like they were a little uncomfortable with this. But and this is such an issue at the abstract level, which divides Americans pretty passionately. But what unites people, and it was such a wonderful interview, because at the bottom of all of these great cases in our history is somebody. right? And to get to know them and doing their work, deciding to make a change in their lives, which they think is consistent with their values and who they are, and they get fired. And I kind of think, you know, somebody said that one of the reasons the revolution in gay rights happened was because gay people came out, and everybody in their workplace and in their family knew. And with transgender people, she's right. You know, it is about getting to know someone, getting to know people. That's not the way the law works all the time.
Yeah, but it did feel like the lawyers were trying to do a little bit of that public education with the justices this morning.
Even the terminology.
Yeah, they were. But it was like Justice Gorsuch, as you said something about this massive social upheaval that might follow. And the lawyer for Amy Stevens, actually from the ACLU, said, look, there are transgender lawyers in this building right now. They're using the bathroom like everybody else. There's no upheaval. It's just people going about their lives. So in a way, that was used as kind of a moment to do some educating of the justices, and maybe the justices sort of paused and said, yeah, that's right, there are a lot of people here at the court who aren't always at the court, a lot of activists, and, you know, the sky wasn't falling. And so some of that was going on even inside the courtroom, I thought.
It was fascinating to watch. Amy Stevens was one of the 3 cases today. There were 2 cases involving gay men who say they were dismissed from their jobs because of their sexual orientation. One of those was Donald Zarda. He was a New York skydiving instructor who says that one of his clients, after they did a jump, complained to the bosses that he had mentioned to her that he was gay at the time of the jump. He subsequently lost his job. He also died in an accident in 2014. But yesterday we caught up with his sister, Melissa Zarda, and former partner, William Moore, to hear his side of this case. Take a listen. Do you remember that day when he lost his job, and did he call you and tell you, you know, gosh, this woman complained that I said I was gay and now I'm fired? What was that like?
I was at my desk at my office when he called, and he was very upset, uncontrollably upset. There was no way to make up and to compensate for what he was losing. So that was financially was what he was most upset about when it comes to the job, is that there's no way to go find another one in mid-season.
Don was so devastated when he was fired that I think this would be his moment to try to make sure that not only would he be able to get justification and everything back that he deserved, but also to prevent this same loss of people being stripped of their job and their means to earn a living from happening to other people. He wanted to make sure that other people didn't suffer the same discrimination.
If the court, this is a conservative majority court,
Scary.
If they come out at the end of this case and say, listen, we don't support or condone discrimination against anybody, including LGBT Americans, but you know, we just don't see it written into the law, how will that make you feel? What will that say to you?
It's gonna mean that they don't see us as an important class of citizen. So that will be disappointing, that they don't feel that we should be protected. But also, I hope that in that course, if that were to happen, that it would inspire the LGBT community to get behind their senators and try and get the Equality Act passed, which is stalled in the Senate at this point.
I think he would tell people to stand up and to not hide who you are at work. Nobody should have to do that. And I think if everybody speaks up and realizes what an issue this is and has been, that, you know, we will be able to keep our rights and protection in place.
Very hands-off is his view.
Our thanks to the Zardas and Bill Moore. Guys, this was fascinating, as you said, Terry, to hear the personal stories. But there was a lot of talk about the law, about Congress's role in all of this. For more on this conversation, I want to bring in David Kaplan, joins us from New York. He's the author of a fascinating book, The Most Dangerous Branch Inside the Supreme Court in the Age of Donald Trump. He's somebody who had covered this court for a long time for Newsweek. David, thank you so much for coming into this, because it was a point that came up a lot today. I wanted to get your take on this idea that the conservatives are going to have to really grapple with this notion of wanting to punt to Congress on some of these policy things, but also adhering to the text. How can they weigh those two things?
Well, that's going to be the thing the lawyers, the justices debate. But, you know, most of us would agree that discrimination against gays and lesbians and transgenders is a bad thing. The question, as you point out, is whether it's the court that should step in and Congress. And to the extent you want an ascendant court to take on this issue, you then kind of have to accept when the court gets involved in other issues, for example, gun control, that you think may be better off left to legislators around the country. What I try to argue in the book, not as my liberal credentials are secure, but what I try to argue in the book is that liberals and conservatives alike ought to be concerned about an overly interventionist court. And remember, the issue here is not whether gays and lesbians and transgenders have a constitutional claim. That is, whether the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection protects them. This is only based on the 1964 law. The day will come when the court has to decide whether gays and lesbians are protected under the 14th Amendment. But it's important to remember this is not that case. When that case comes forward, I think I might be singing a very different tune. But on the more narrow issue of what the law covers, I think the court ought to tread lightly.
This is also the first test on gay rights for this new conservative majority. First time that Neil Gorsuch is on the bench. Justice Kavanaugh's on the bench, Terry. We didn't hear much from Justice Kavanaugh today, which surprised a lot of people. He was almost silent for 2 hours.
One question, and it didn't go anywhere. It didn't really seem to land and generate any conversation. And it's the first case on a major gay rights issue without Justice Anthony Kennedy, who really was the champion pushing the law forward constitutionally and otherwise, bringing gay and lesbian people into the full embrace of citizenship under the Constitution, and lionized for that, essentially. And I think that at the end of the day, he will be missed. This case would have obviously turned out very differently if Anthony Kennedy had still been on the court, but we haven't heard from Kavanaugh on it yet.
We haven't. David Kaplan, what's your take on how Kavanaugh will influence this discussion of gay rights on this landmark case?
He has not said a whole lot, either in speeches or in decisions at the lower court. But if I were in the prediction game, and I'm invariably wrong, my guess would be that the court will rule 5-4 against the claim from gays and lesbians and transgenders. They will interpret the 1964 statute narrowly, and that will be read as a decision of the conservative court against gays and lesbians. But I think, depending on how it's written, it might be more fairly interpreted as just a piece of punting to Congress the issue. The problem, though, and the reason the conservatives on the court are often hypocrites, is they don't punt other issues to Congress. So whether it's on campaign finance in the Citizens United case or the Voting Rights Act, the court was all too happy to strike down an act of Congress and take it upon themselves to decide what the law was and not allow senators and representatives to do so. So it's a question of consistency and hypocrisy.
Kate Shaw, what's your bottom line on what we heard today and what people need to know about this case, which is now going into the conference room? Yeah. They're gonna vote. They've heard the arguments, going to read the briefs. What's the big takeaway? Well, we'll know either way by the end of June, and I think maybe earlier. Maybe to David's point, if it is true that these plaintiffs lose, then there's sort of that's the end of the line in terms of going to federal court to try to get protection, and then people are going to have to turn to legislatures, right? So to Congress, as David suggested. The one thing I might qualify that with is, it used to be the case that the Congress and the court were in an active dialogue, but Congress is pretty gridlocked right now. So it's not quite so simple as saying, you take these arguments to Congress and we'll change the law that way. So, state legislatures, localities, all these places can confer these kinds of protections if there's a vacuum that crops up because the court interprets the federal law not to protect people who live in places where there's no local protection right now. Fascinating discussion. Terry Moran, our chief national correspondent, Kate Shaw, legal analyst. Thank you so much. David Kaplan joining us from New York. Thank you so much. We could talk for hours. Hope to see you guys soon back here on Decision Day. Meantime, just across the street over here at the United States Capitol today, the impeachment battle is heating up, and we're getting new signs of just how interested the public is in this battle and learning more facts. Take a look at this new poll from the Washington Post and the Shore School over at George Washington University. This shows growing support right now. 58% of Americans in this latest poll say that they support the impeachment inquiry into President Trump. Just 38% do not, and there is quite a stark breakdown by party. I think we have that as well, with independents now also supporting this, Republicans being very concerned about where this is going. going, but take a look. This is just the independents. 49% support removing President Trump, which is pretty significant. This among Republicans, obviously much lower, but has risen over the past few weeks. Mary Alice Parks is our deputy political director. She's here. What's your takeaway on all of these new numbers and the continued climb? It's inching up higher and higher on support for this.
Look, Devin, I am always careful about leaning too much into one single poll, but this has been a trend over the last few weeks. We've actually seen quite significant movement, both over the question of starting an impeachment inquiry, as well as that secondary question about removing the president from office. I was struck there by that last number. You saw 20% of Republicans in this latest poll saying they were okay with removing the president from office. That is not the kind of number that the president's re-election campaign would
just
like.
dwell on that for a second. 20% of Republicans in this poll would support removing Trump. I mean, it's hard to put your mind around that. That is much higher than you would think.
This is one poll. We are always very careful that these are one polls. We've been seeing movement like this across a number of polls. We've been tracking a lot of it, and 538 has been tracking it as well. And it seems to be a pattern, and a pattern that's moving quickly.
It sure is. Let's bring in Catherine Faulders now into this conversation. She's our investigative reporter joining us from the D.C. Bureau because she has some new reporting breaking right now, new details about the level of concern inside the White House. White House officials with President Trump's phone call with the president of Ukraine back in July. Catherine, what are you learning?
Yeah, and we know from that original whistleblower complaint that this whistleblower says that he or she spoke to White House officials to gather information about the president's call with the Ukrainian president. But we're reporting now we've learned about this new memo that was written by this whistleblower just one day after the call took place. This whistleblower writes, this first whistleblower says, describes White House officials as crazy, or as the call as crazy and frightening. The whistleblower says that the White House official that he was speaking to get information about the president's call with the Ukrainian president was, quote, visibly shaken. So after the whistleblower had this conversation with this official, he or she went back and typed up and wrote up a 2-page memo describing this, Devin. And it really does illustrate the level of concern, according to the whistleblower, of close aides to the president. And this whistleblower writes that this White House official was listening to the entirety of that phone call.
Certainly significant new evidence and development, much more at abcnews.com. Meanwhile, Catherine, stand by, because we also want to talk about this development today up here on Capitol Hill. White House showing some defiance in the face of congressional subpoenas, requests to talk to key players in that phone call. There's this guy.
Democrats have a different word for it. They're calling it flat-out obstruction.
Obstruction. This involves today a central figure in the president's Ukraine policy, EU Ambassador Gordon Sondland. And Mary Alice, we were talking before the show. This is someone that holds a lot of keys to what the president may have been thinking in this phone call, what his broader strategy was, why that money was withheld. He was supposed to be up here today answering questions, but declined to come.
Well, he says that he was willing to come, but the State Department basically put the kibosh on that, said he was not allowed to come testify. They were saying that it would have been a sham hearing. Now, like I said, Democrats are saying this is a major escalation. They are saying this could be evidence of obstruction from this administration. And so in some ways, the fact that he did not come to testify might be working to strengthen Democrats' position as they write articles of impeachment.
And they might write it in there. Catherine Faulders, what are you hearing about whether he may ultimately come? Is this a temporary delay in this process, or is the White House insisting he shouldn't answer at all?
Look, I think Mary Alice was right when she said that. He mentioned that he did want to come up, but look, Devin, this is now a broader strategy from the White House, completely stonewalling on these investigations. I know from sources I've been talking to inside the White House that they think that they've made this phone call transcript, the partial transcript, their version of it, public. They've made the whistleblower complaint public. In their mind, they say, what else do Democrats on Capitol Hill possibly need? So we will see the White House continue to stonewall. I think the other important point I want to make quickly is that Republicans also want Nancy Pelosi to have a formal vote, to hold a formal vote to open a formal impeachment inquiry on the House floor. There's been some discussion saying that we won't cooperate at all until she does something like that. So I think maybe we'll see some formal communication on that front, Devin, but it is part of a broader strategy. We will continue to see this. You saw the president tweet about this too. So they just aren't willing to cooperate at all, really, on this front.
Great reporting, Catherine Faulders. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. Meanwhile, up here on Capitol Hill, Mary Alice, there's a different story that has almost eclipsed impeachment this week. This involves the president's abrupt decision to pull back troops in Syria.
And Republicans have called it a catastrophic mistake, short-sighted, irresponsible, a threat to national security. Again, those are words from Republicans up here on Capitol Hill.
Agreeing with Nancy Pelosi, Hillary Clinton, it's extraordinary to see so much unanimity.
See Speaker Pelosi and Republican Senate Leader Mitch McConnell agree on anything these days, but they have been lockstep together over the last 24 hours, really pushing back against the president's words on this.
Louis Martinez is our senior Pentagon reporter, been tracking the developments after the president's announcement. Louis, is there any indication that the president has given pause to any of this in light of the criticism, or are troops already being pulled back?
No, Devin, the only troops that have been pulled back are those 50 or so that were at 2 observation posts right on the Syrian border with Turkey. Those are 2 major border crossings, and you can expect that if the Turks do launch an invasion or an incursion into northern Syria, that it's going to be at those points. So they've pulled them out beyond a 5-mile radius there, back to regular parts that outside of the security mechanism zone, as it's called. So that's the only thing that's happened in terms of a pullback. Now, what we have heard is that, yes, if in case the Turks do go deeper into Syria, that the rest of the U.S. troops here, the 1,000 U.S. troops that are inside Syria, there might be consideration to pull them back within 30 days, totally out of the country. But we're not there yet. As of right now, it's just those 50 troops that were in there up in those 2 observation points.
And Louis, real quickly, because we're almost out of time, how do we make sense of the implications in this? It seems that the president's sort of trying to spin this with his tweets again, making clear that he doesn't want Turkey to actually invade and nothing's actually going to go wrong. How should people put their minds around the human cost of what this decision may be?
Well, the human cost of this decision, I think, was outlined by General Joseph Votel, who was the former top U.S. military commander in the Middle East. He gave some remarks here in town today, and he talked about the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Kurds. He talked about the level of sacrifice that they've had, over 11,000 fighters who've died in their campaign against ISIS. And he said we should not go without noticing that. And he also said that he believes that yesterday's action could go a long way to making it difficult for the United States to build partnerships in that part of the world in the future. But, you know, General Votel, he says he's very disappointed because the Kurds have done so much for the United States, going beyond what was even asked of them in the fight against ISIS. And so we're really going to see now in the next couple of days where the Turkey does push in and maybe causes another humanitarian crisis in the region.
Louis Martinez at the Pentagon. Thanks so much, Louis. Appreciate that.
And just before we came on the air, we had Republicans and Democrats together in the Senate demanding a closed-door briefing for senators on this very issue. They want more information.
And we will see if that materializes. They are back next week. Going to be an eventful week up here on Capitol Hill. It's great to have you with us. Mary Alice Parks at the court. Great to have you with us on this special edition of the briefing room this afternoon. We're here every day, 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time, 5:30 and 6:30 on ABC News Live. Download the ABC News app to track us 24/7. I'm Devin Dwyer here at the court. Hope to see you back tomorrow.